I taught for 14 years without a single complaint. Then one student's disappearance turned an entire town against me for a crime I didn't commit. I need to preface this by saying that in 14 years of teaching high school English, I had never once received a written complaint, a disciplinary note, or even a raised voice from a parent. And I say this not to brag, but because it matters for what comes later. Because when the accusations started, people acted like I had a history, like there was a pattern, like this was somehow inevitable, and there wasn't, and it wasn't. And I want that on the record before I tell you what happened to me during the 11 weeks that took my career, my apartment, and very nearly my sense of who I was, and gave it all back to me changed. My name doesn't matter for this story, so let's just say I go by Ms. Halden, and I taught third period American literature at a public high school in a mid-sized town where everybody knew everybody's business within about 6 hours of it happening, which turned out to be extremely relevant. The girl at the center of all this, I'll call Wren, because that's not her name, but it fits the way she was. Quiet, watchful, the kind of kid who sat in the back corner by the window and never raised her hand, but always turned her homework in on time and always scored somewhere between a B+ and an A-. Reliable in that specific, unremarkable way that means a teacher's brain quietly files a kid under fine and doesn't think about her much, because there are 29 other kids in the room and the ones who are struggling get the oxygen. Around the start of October, that started to change. Wren stopped turning things in. She started keeping her phone in her lap under the desk, glancing down at it every few minutes with this specific furtive energy that every teacher learns to recognize by year 3, and her quiz grades dropped from the low 90s into the 60s almost overnight. I kept her after class on the 8th of October, gentle about it, the way you learn to be, and asked if everything was okay at home, if she needed to talk to the counselor, if there was anything going on that I should know about as her teacher. She looked at me for a second like she was deciding whether I was safe, and then she said she was just tired, that she'd been staying up late, and that she was fine, and I did what every teacher does in that moment, which is note it, worry about it privately, resolve to keep an eye on her, and then get pulled back into the enormous machine of managing 140 students across 5 periods, because that's the job. And you cannot chase down every kid who seems a little off, or you'll never teach a single class. I want to be very clear that I flagged this. I made a note in my private log. Every teacher keeps one, a habit drilled into us specifically to protect ourselves and our students, that Wren seemed withdrawn and that her academic performance had declined, dated October 8th. That note would end up being one of the most important pieces of paper in my life, though I didn't know it yet. 6 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon, Wren raised her hand about 15 minutes before the bell and asked to use the restroom. She had her backpack with her, which I noticed, the way you notice these small things without really registering them as significant, and for about half a second I thought about telling her to leave it. And then I thought about how 16-year-old girls sometimes carry their bags to the bathroom for reasons that are none of a male administration's business, and I let it go, because I did not want to be the teacher who humiliates a girl over a tampon, essentially. And so I said, sure, go ahead, and she left. And that was the last time I ever saw her in my classroom. The bell rang 40 minutes later. Her seat was empty. I did what you're supposed to do, which is report it immediately to the front office, and the front office did what they're supposed to do, which is call around, check the other exits, check with the nurse, check with her other teachers, and by the end of the day, when nobody had eyes on her anywhere in the building or on any bus, the school called her parents, and her parents said she hadn't come home, and that was the moment this stopped being a school problem and became a police matter. What followed were 3 of the strangest, most disorienting days of my professional life. Detectives interviewed me 4 times. 4. They wanted to know the exact minute she asked to leave, what her tone was like, what she was wearing, whether she'd seemed anxious, whether I'd noticed anything odd about the backpack, whether I had any personal relationship with her outside of class, a question that made my stomach drop the first time I heard it, because I understood immediately what they were really asking, even though nobody said it out loud. On the second day, Wren's mother, I'll call her Carol, came to the school in the middle of the afternoon and found her way to the hallway outside my classroom during my planning period, and she screamed at me. I mean that literally, she screamed. Loud enough that 3 other teachers came out of their rooms. Loud enough that a class of freshmen in the room next to mine sat frozen and silent, listening to every word through the wall. And what she screamed was that I was irresponsible, that I had let her daughter walk out of my classroom with a packed bag and hadn't stopped her, that this was my fault, that I should have known, that I should have called someone, that some quiet part of her was already deciding right there in the hallway that blaming a teacher was going to be easier than sitting with the alternative. Wren's father stood a few feet behind her the whole time, arms crossed, not saying much, but nodding along, and at one point he said, loud enough for me to hear clearly, that the school needed to get rid of people who can't do their jobs. And I stood there and took it, because what else do you do? Because I had a police investigation hanging over my head, and I did not yet know that I hadn't done anything wrong in any legal sense, only that I felt in my bones responsible in some vague, diffuse way that I couldn't yet articulate. That night, the local news ran a segment. They didn't name me technically, but they said, a teacher is being investigated after failing to notice a student's 40-minute absence, which in a town of 40,000 people is the same as naming me, because everybody knew which third period class had gone missing a girl from. And by the next morning, I had strangers slowing their cars down in front of my apartment building, and a woman at the grocery store who recognized me from a photo someone had posted posted in a community Facebook group and told me, to my face, over the cereal aisle, that I should be ashamed of myself. 6 days after she vanished, police located Ren at a motel 2 states away, in the company of a 26-year-old man I'll call Cody, who worked at an auto detailing shop and who, it turned out, had been talking to her online for the better part of 8 months. When the full picture came out, it was almost unbearably mundane in its predictability. She'd met him in a comment section under a video, they'd moved to private messages, then to a different app her parents didn't monitor, then to phone calls late at night with the volume turned down, and over the course of those 8 months, he had very patiently, very deliberately, made himself the only person in her life who understood her, who wasn't disappointed in her, who thought she was special. Until by the time she climbed out from behind that classroom window of a life she was living, she genuinely believed she was choosing this, that it was her decision, made freely, and in her formal statement to police. I read parts of it later during the disciplinary process because it became evidence in my own defense. She said explicitly that she had been planning this for weeks, that she had packed the bag the night before, that she had specifically chosen my third period to make her move because it ended close enough to the final bell of the day that she'd have extra time before anyone noticed. And I remember this line specifically because it appeared in 3 separate documents over the following months. No teacher could have stopped me. Police closed the investigation into me within about a week of finding her. No wrongdoing, no negligence, nothing. I remember the detective who called to tell me sounding almost apologetic, like he knew this wasn't actually the end of anything for me, even though on paper it was supposed to be. He was right. Carol and her husband did not accept the conclusion. Rather than absorb what must have been a genuinely unbearable truth, that their daughter had spent 8 months lying to them in their own house, under their own roof, while they had no idea, they requested a formal meeting with the school board, and less than 72 hours after the police cleared me, I got an email at 3:45 on a Friday afternoon informing me that the district was opening its own internal investigation into whether I had exercised adequate supervisory judgment, which is a phrase I will hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life. I called my union representative that night, a guy I'll call Marcus, who had the calm, slightly world-weary energy of someone who had watched 100 good teachers get thrown to the wolves over the years and had learned exactly how the machine worked. His first instruction to me was simple. Pull every record you have, attendance logs, lesson plans, bathroom pass records for the entire semester, and, crucially, that private note from October 8th, the one where I'd flagged Ren's behavioral shift 3 weeks before she disappeared, because that note proved I had been paying attention, that I hadn't missed anything, that I had in fact done exactly what a responsible teacher is supposed to do when a student seems off. Marcus told me something I've thought about 100 times since. This isn't really about you. This is about the district figuring out whether it's cheaper to blame you or defend you. I didn't understand what he meant until later. My principal, a man I'll call Mr. Osgood, called me into his office the following Monday, and where I had hoped for some kind of support, what I got instead was a man visibly sweating under the pressure coming down from the superintendent's office. Because Ren's parents had, by that point, hired a media consultant and were threatening to go to the regional news outlets with a story about a school that let a predator walk a child out the door. Osgood asked me, and I remember this verbatim because it's carved into me. Is there anything you're not telling me? Not are you okay? Not how are you holding up? But a question that presumed guilt, that treated me like a liability to be assessed rather than a colleague of 14 years to be protected. And I understood in that exact moment that the school had already decided, on some level, that I might be sacrificed if it made the problem go away faster. The first formal interview with the school board's review panel happened 11 days after Ren was found. It was run by a board member I'll call Deborah Fitch, a woman with a flat prosecutorial affect who spent 40 straight minutes trying to get me to say I had done something wrong, circling back again and again to the bathroom pass and the backpack, asking why I hadn't confiscated it, why I hadn't walked her to the restroom myself, why I hadn't called security the second she didn't return within 10 minutes instead of waiting for the bell. Marcus sat next to me the entire time with the district's own policy handbook open on the table, and at one point he simply read aloud, word for word, the official guidance on hallway passes, which stated that a teacher is not required to escort or supervise a student during a routine restroom request, and that a report is considered timely if filed within the same class period, and I had filed mine within 4 minutes of the bell ringing, well inside the window. Deborah didn't have much to say after that. The second interview, about a week later, added a new player, a woman from the county prosecutor's office I'll call Renata Cole, brought in ostensibly as an independent observer, but who spent most of the meeting asking a version of the same trap question dressed up different ways, the cruelest form of which was, looking back now with everything you know, is there anything you would have done differently that day? Marcus cut in before I could even open my mouth and said flatly that hindsight bias was not an appropriate standard for evaluating a decision made in real time with none of the information we now had, and that if the panel wanted to evaluate my conduct, they needed to evaluate it against what a reasonable teacher would have known on October 14th, not against a police report that didn't exist until 6 days later. It was during a private conversation with Marcus after that second interview that I got the sentence that finally made the whole thing click into place for me. He told me quietly in the parking lot that this wasn't really a disciplinary process in the way I understood the term. It was a cost-benefit calculation. The district's lawyers were trying trying to figure out whether it would be cheaper, in the event Ren's parents followed through on a lawsuit, to have already disciplined me as a show of accountability, or to have a clean record showing they'd investigated and found nothing. And every single question in every single meeting was underneath the surface, serving that calculation and not any actual interest in fairness. Somewhere in the middle of all this, a woman named Faye Dunmore entered the picture, hired by Ren's parents as what they called a family communications consultant, which in practice meant a media strategist whose entire job was to keep the story alive in the local press for as long as it took to force some kind of visible consequence for somebody. Faye called my union rep directly, twice, trying to get me to agree to a joint statement that would have included language admitting a lapse in situational awareness, phrasing so carefully vague that it would have meant nothing legally and everything publicly. And when Marcus declined on my behalf both times, she pivoted to feeding quotes to a regional television reporter who ran a 3-part series that framed the entire saga as a cautionary tale about gaps in school supervision, using file footage of my building's front entrance over ominous music in a way that made my stomach turn every time it aired, which, thanks to the local station's rotation, was approximately 4 times a day for the better part of a week. During that same stretch, the school's front office started fielding calls from parents who had nothing to do with my classes at all, some of them asking whether it was true I'd been let go, a rumor that had somehow calcified into fact despite never being announced anywhere, which meant I spent an exhausting amount of energy simply correcting people who assumed the worst had already happened. There was a particularly surreal afternoon when a local radio call-in show spent almost 20 minutes debating my competence with callers who, as far as I could tell, had exactly zero first-hand information about me, my classroom, or the actual events of that Tuesday. One caller going so far as to suggest that teachers like me should be required to carry students' phones during bathroom breaks, an idea so impractical it would have been funny in any other context. I want to mention, too, a smaller betrayal that stung more than the anonymous ones, which was a fellow teacher, someone I'll call Greg, who taught social studies down the hall and who I'd always considered a friend, going so far as to grab coffee with me most Friday mornings for years. About 3 weeks into the investigation, Greg gave an interview to that same regional reporter, unnamed as a colleague who requested anonymity, in which he said that he'd always thought something seemed a little off about how I ran my classroom, a comment so vague and so obviously manufactured for a soundbite that I recognized his voice pattern the second I heard the segment, even without his name attached, because I'd been listening to that voice every Friday morning for 6 years. I never confronted him about it. I didn't have the energy, and honestly, some part of me understood in a bleak way that fear does strange things to people, that he was probably terrified of being associated with me in any capacity while the story was still hot, and that his cowardice, while it hurt, wasn't really about me at all. Meanwhile, Ren's father took a more direct approach than his wife, calling the district's main office line repeatedly, sometimes multiple times a day, demanding updates on when the teacher would be removed, until, according to a secretary who eventually told me this in confidence months later, the front desk staff had a standing instruction to transfer his calls straight to voicemail because his tone had crossed into something the office manager described carefully as not appropriate for a workplace phone line. Through all of this, my own family reacted in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. My mother, who lived 2 states away and mostly got her information from the same viral social media posts everyone else did, called me in a panic after seeing my photo shared in a parenting group with a caption implying I'd been fired for negligence, and I spent 45 minutes on the phone that night just talking her down, explaining the actual facts, listening to her cry a little with relief once she understood none of it was true, and then hanging up and sitting alone in my kitchen, feeling more drained than I had after any single interview with the school board. My younger brother, meanwhile, wanted to drive up and, in his words, have a conversation with whoever had spray painted my classroom door, an offer I appreciated and firmly declined, because the last thing my situation needed was a family member getting arrested for confronting a stranger over graffiti. Through it all, though, there were smaller kindnesses that kept me upright. An anonymous student left a sticky note on my desk one morning that just said, "We know it's not your fault," no signature, which I still have folded in a drawer at home. The school custodian, an older man named Walt, who'd worked there longer than I'd been alive, quietly repainted my door himself on a Saturday without being asked and without ever mentioning it to me directly, and I only found out it was him because another custodian let it slip weeks later. Even a couple of the detectives who'd interviewed me during those first chaotic days reached out informally and somewhat against protocol, I'm sure, just to say they didn't think I had anything to worry about once the picture became clear, which meant more to me at the time than they probably realized. While all of this ground on for weeks, my life outside those interview rooms was quietly falling apart in smaller, meaner ways. Enrollment in my classes started dropping as parents filed transfer requests, quietly, one by one, no explanation given, until I was teaching to rooms with visible gaps where desks used to be full. Kids who did stay stopped meeting my eyes in the hallway. Not out of judgment exactly, more a kind of secondhand embarrassment, the way teenagers absorb adult anxiety without understanding it. A colleague I'll call Priya, who taught across the hall and had been kind to me for years, started sneaking into my room during her free period just to sit with me for 5 minutes, months. But she told me, guilt all over her face, that the administration had sent an email instructing staff not to discuss the situation publicly, not even to express support, for fear of the district appearing to have prejudged the outcome. The local paper ran a follow-up piece with my photo in it this time, not blurred, and after that the emails started, dozens of them. Strangers I had never met, explaining in detail what kind of person they thought I was. Someone spray-painted something ugly on my classroom door over a weekend, and it took maintenance 3 days to get to it because, I was told later, nobody wanted to be the one photographed cleaning up that teacher's door. My landlord, a normally easygoing guy who'd never given me trouble in 6 years, called to say he'd been getting calls from other tenants worried about negative attention on the building and asked in a roundabout, deeply uncomfortable way whether I'd consider not renewing my lease. Ren's parents, not satisfied with the internal review, filed a formal complaint with the State Department of Education demanding an investigation into my teaching credential, and somewhere in there, an online petition calling for my termination picked up just over 200 signatures, most of them, as far as I could tell, from people who had never set foot in my classroom or my town. I want to be honest and say there was a night, probably around week 6, sitting in my apartment with the blinds closed because I didn't want to see if anyone was outside, where I genuinely considered just resigning, just letting them have the win, because it felt like it would never end, and like nothing I said was going to matter to people who had already decided the story they wanted to believe. What changed things was a woman I'll call Vanessa Kwan, an attorney whose son had been in my class 2 years earlier, who reached out and asked to meet me for coffee, unprompted, no ulterior motive that I could ever find. Just a parent who had watched the local coverage and thought something didn't add up. She'd read the released portions of the police report, public record by that point, and she told me plainly, over lukewarm coffee in a nearly empty cafe, that she thought what was happening to me was a textbook case of a community needing somewhere to put its grief and settling on the nearest available target, and she offered, without me even asking, to speak at the next public school board meeting on my behalf. That meeting happened on a Tuesday evening in the school auditorium, packed tighter than I'd seen it in years, and it opened with Carol standing up and, through tears that I do not doubt were genuine, describing in detail how her daughter had come home, changed, traumatized, and how she believed I bore responsibility for not protecting her from herself. I sat there and let it wash over me because there was nothing productive in interrupting a grieving mother, however much I disagreed with where she was aiming her grief. Then Vanessa stood up. She was calm, in a way that somehow cut through the room more effectively than any amount of volume could have. She read directly from the police report, the parts where Ren stated she had planned the escape for weeks, packed the night before, and specifically said no teacher could have stopped her. And then she said something I will remember for the rest of my life, close to word for word. It is strange to me that this room is spending its anger on a teacher for allowing a bathroom break, when nobody in this room has asked how a 26-year-old man was permitted to speak with a 16-year-old girl every single night for 8 months inside her own house without anyone noticing. The room went very quiet after that. It didn't end there. Grief doesn't work that neatly, but something shifted. Over the next 20 minutes, 4 other parents got up, unprompted, and talked about things I'd done for their kids over the years that I'd honestly half forgotten. One mother describing how I'd stayed late every day for a month to help her son catch up after a family emergency. A former student, now in college, who'd driven 3 hours to say I was the reason she'd applied to study English at all. 2 weeks after that meeting, the school board issued its formal finding: no violation of any policy, no negligence, no disciplinary action of any kind. They did tack on a line, almost as an afterthought, about reviewing hallway pass procedures going forward, which Marcus told me privately was just political cover, a way for the district to look like it had done something without actually admitting it had put an innocent teacher through 11 weeks of hell for nothing. 3 months later, the state education department dismissed the credential complaint outright, citing insufficient grounds. Nobody from the district or the school ever apologized to me directly. Osgood did stop by my classroom on his own, weeks after it was all over, and said, quietly and a little awkwardly, that he knew what I'd been through and that he respected how I'd handled it, which is not an apology but was, I think, the closest thing I was ever going to get. And I decided to accept it as such because holding out for more would have just cost me more peace I didn't have to spare. Slowly, without a word of explanation, some of the transfer requests reversed themselves, and kids started reappearing in my roster like nothing had happened, and a few of them, in their own halting 16-year-old way, apologized for having avoided me, which honestly moved me more than any adult ever managed to. As for Ren, I never taught her again. She transferred to a different school for what I assume were very understandable reasons, but I heard secondhand that she was doing better, and I hope that's true, because none of what happened to me changes the fact that she was the actual victim in this entire story, a kid who was targeted and manipulated by someone who knew exactly what he was doing, and it has never sat right with me that so much of the public anger in this got redirected at me instead of at him. I thought seriously about leaving the profession. I did not. I told myself that walking away would mean letting a false story win, and I wasn't willing to give it that. Instead, I stayed, and the following year I joined a district committee alongside Marcus, working specifically on policies to protect teachers from exactly this kind of runaway blame cycle, when something goes wrong that was never within their control to prevent. There's one more piece of this I haven't mentioned yet, which is what happened with my teaching credential renewal, which was scheduled to come up for its routine 5-year review right in the middle of all this chaos. Timing so unlucky it almost felt engineered, though of course it wasn't. Normally, that process is a formality, a stack of paperwork and a modest fee. But because the state complaint from Ren's parents was still technically open when my renewal paperwork crossed a reviewer's desk, the whole thing got flagged and frozen pending the outcome of their investigation, which meant that for a stretch of nearly 2 months, I was, on paper, teaching without a currently valid credential, a detail the district's HR department handled so clumsily that I received 2 separate letters in the same week, one reassuring me that my employment was not at risk during the review period, and another, clearly generated by an automated compliance system that hadn't gotten the memo, warning me that continued instruction without a valid credential could result in termination. I called HR in something close to a panic, and the woman on the phone, apologetic but clearly overwhelmed by her own bureaucracy, told me to just ignore the second letter, which is not exactly the kind of reassurance that helps you sleep at night when your entire livelihood is balanced on a stranger's judgment call in an office you've never seen. Marcus ended up having to draft a formal letter on union letterhead just to get the state board to acknowledge that the credential freeze and the disciplinary investigation, while related in origin, were legally separate processes and that one shouldn't be held hostage by the other. And it took another 3 weeks of him following up before the freeze was lifted, weeks during which I genuinely did not know whether I would still have a job to come back to once the paperwork sorted itself out. I also want to talk about the toll this took in ways that had nothing to do with meetings or letters, because I think people who haven't lived through something like this imagine it as a series of discrete events with recovery time in between, when really it was more like a constant low hum of dread that never fully switched off, even on the days when nothing official happened at all. I stopped sleeping through the night sometime around week 3 and didn't really get it back until months after the board's final ruling. I lost weight I didn't have to lose, the kind of thing well-meaning people comment on at the grocery store without understanding what's underneath it. I started avoiding the parts of town where I knew Ren's family shopped or worshipped, rerouting drives that used to take 10 minutes into 25-minute loops around the edge of town, a habit that, embarrassingly, took me almost a year to fully unlearn even after the whole thing was long resolved. I saw a therapist for the first time in my life during that period, something I'm not embarrassed to say now, though I was cagey about it then, worried that even seeking help would somehow be twisted into evidence that something was wrong with me, which tells you something about the state of mind the whole ordeal had put me in. She was the one, actually, who first pointed out to me that I'd started apologizing reflexively for things that had nothing to do with any of this, bumping into a chair and saying sorry 3 times, a small tic that had crept in without my noticing, and that took real, deliberate effort to unlearn. The financial side of it doesn't get talked about much in these stories either, but it was real. My landlord situation eventually resolved itself when I found a quieter building across town and simply moved rather than fight about it, which cost me a security deposit I never fully recovered, and 2 months of paying rent in 2 places while my old lease wound down. I also, for about 6 weeks, hired a lawyer privately, separate from the union representation, just to have someone review everything with an eye toward whether Ren's parents' threats of a civil suit against me personally had any real teeth. And while Marcus assured me repeatedly that as a public school employee acting within the scope of my duties, I was almost certainly protected from personal liability, almost certainly is not a phrase that lets you sleep easily when someone is actively telling reporters they want to sue you, and that lawyer, while ultimately unnecessary, was not free. Looking back, I think the hardest part wasn't any single meeting or any single cruel email. It was the compounding effect of never getting to just be a person for 11 straight weeks, of every single interaction with a stranger at the grocery store, with my own mother on the phone, with a colleague in the break room, being filtered through the question of whether they'd seen the news and what they thought they knew about me. Almost a year to the day after it all started, a student in my class, a new one, who knew nothing about any of this, asked during a discussion about an unreliable narrator in the novel we were reading how you're supposed to know what's true when everyone tells the story differently. I told her something I'd had a long time to think about by then, that the truth isn't always powerful enough to change someone's mind, because sometimes people only believe what they've already decided to believe, and the only thing you can actually control, in the end, is your own integrity, whether you can look at what you did and stand behind it, regardless of who's willing to believe you. So, Ada, for refusing to publicly apologize to Ren's parents after everyone, including the police and the school board, cleared me of any wrongdoing? Marcus says no. Vanessa says no. I'd like a second opinion.